Darwin Shurig, President of Shurig Solutions Incorporated. Our company is focused on solving the biggest challenges for medical device, IVD, and pharma companies in a variety of areas. And I'm really excited to have Shalom Strickland on as a guest today. Very excited. So she's the Senior Manufacturing Engineering Manager at TransEnterix in Morrisville, North Carolina. It's been there for almost 2 years now. I've had the pleasure of knowing Shalom for about 4 years now, and first got to know her when she was a process engineering manager at Invacare. She's got a master's in manufacturing management, a bachelor's in industrial engineering, a bachelor's in applied mathematics. I believe it's an applied mathematics versus math, because she's an underachiever. So, you know, only a couple of degrees, right? But over 20 years of engineering experience in electronics and automotive industries initially, and then transferred over into the medical device industry in 2012. Expertise in industrial engineering applications, process engineering, quality engineering oversight, and manufacturing. And she understands manufacturing product excellence from multiple aspects of the business, really, and strong expertise in continuous process improvements, decreasing cost, design quality, all aspects of validation, technology transfer, and really implementing best practices or business process solutions, best practices across the entire business. So I'm really excited to talk to you about a variety of things today. She's also very kind and very big on volunteer and community. So I'm excited about our discussion tonight. We're going to talk about manufacturing overall, relevant to the pandemic and how that's complicated manufacturing, repositioning and repurposing of talent. We're going to talk about PDCA, dust that off a little bit for people maybe that have been thinking about that in different terminology or ways previously. And then we'll talk about some other, insights about leadership and proactivity and where the medtech industry is going. So without further ado, welcome. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you tonight.
Thank you, Darwin. I appreciate the invitation. I look forward to conversing with you this evening about those topics and any others that could come about during the conversation. I think that since we all have been in the pandemic, we've been exposed to some things that are surprises. We've been exposed to some things that we could have maybe predicted or wish we had predicted a little sooner. So as we go through this conversation this evening, sure, let's bring in any topics that may come up and we can explore them further. I look into.
Yeah, I think
go ahead.
Sorry, I think there's a little bit of a delay, but as I was, we were talking about earlier before we first got on, I mean, I definitely want to dive in. You're in the Surgical Robotic Platform industry, which in 2019 was about a $7 billion market and is predicted within the next 6 years to grow exponentially from a revenue standpoint, predicted to over double $21 billion. So I want to talk, I definitely want to get into some of that. I want to get into what's going on with telehealth, with remote work. So there's a lot of different things I want us to be able to tie into. But why don't we start out with what you've seen? You came to your position, the year before the pandemic hit. You're involved in an important technology transfer at your company. And so why don't you talk to us a little bit about how things have changed, some of the challenges that you've seen relevant to manufacturing pre-pandemic and then now?
Absolutely. As you mentioned, I've been with TransEnterix just under 2 years, and we've made a lot of transformation and transition happen in that time and in that space. I came into the position to oversee a transfer of a manufacturing process from Europe over to the United States. So we moved a portion of our manufacturing process into the US. And in that move, we encountered a couple of things that are typical in moving both products and physical tools. Nothing uncommon that we couldn't get over, but the interesting piece of being able to manage within FDA and also within the European notified body was to make sure that we were compliant, of course, with all of our documentation, all of our validation, and all of the EFTs, equipment, fixtures, and tools that go along with those. So to make that long story short, we were able to move a portion of the manufacturing set aside just for tests, so end of line testing. So think about a widget that you assemble, that you test, and that you pack. Just in simple terms, we were able to take the second portion of the manufacturing process, the test, and the third portion, the pack out, and move those into the United States. And that helped us to divide up the portfolio such that we could build and test and pack for the Europe customers market. And then we could also test and pack for customers in the market in the United States. And that helped to reduce some of the costs involved in some of the manufacturing process, from transit, from logistics, from storage space. All of those things were involved in making this transformation of that manufacturing process.
So I think it would be, obviously you've got some confidential things. You got to be careful about that kind of stuff. Don't want to get you in trouble or anything, but I've had the opportunity to see the TransEnterix product up close, get a tour of it. It's amazing technology, what it can do. And one aspect of why the robotic surgical industry, one of the perspectives of that growth is, certainly there's a lot of investment in artificial intelligence, and the idea of that robotic piece and the lack of patient contact. Obviously that ties into the positives from a pandemic standpoint of mitigating the risk of getting the virus. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, because you have the surgical system, and then you have the additional secondary products that can tie into that, and then maybe talk a little bit about what that process looks like, because you've got this huge system, and manufacturing is one aspect of it, but then you also have to validate the systems before you can sell that piece off. So maybe you could share a little bit of insight there.
Yeah, absolutely. Without covering proprietary information, I'll try to talk in general terms, but you're absolutely right. So the product that we make is a solution for laparoscopic surgery. I'll just say that. And it enables the surgeon to have, within his operating realm, control of the device that is assisting with the surgery or performing the surgery. And in this space, it's, as you bring up, as we talk about the pandemic and challenges, one of the things that we see in hospitals is overcrowding. Right. We see lots of, in and out of patients. And when you're trying to create distance, this is one of the tools that has helped to change the market and change the way that we think about doing surgery. Right. So it does encourage that distance between the surgeon and the patient, but it's with technology that allows for clean and clean room, operating room environment compliance as well.
I believe that the physician can actually control certain aspects with his eyes, correct? Through your system.
There is a feature in the system that gives control along with the other tools that the surgeon is using for tracking eye movement as well with this robot.
Okay.
That's true. Yeah.
Now, what, from a manufacturing standpoint, from the time that you get an order for one of the systems to the point that it's actually able to be delivered, can you give us a little perspective of what that looks like in terms of making the product and then actually validating processes and systems to where it can actually be delivered?
Yeah, that's interesting. So you spoke a little bit about my background and coming from my former employer where we were making, 400 to 500 units a day of
Right.
6 or 7 different types. We had definitely high volume, low mix. This manufacturing process is the opposite in a lot of ways, right? So we have low volume where we're only making one system, every so many weeks. And then we have just the one or two. I guess it really depends upon how you customize your robot.
Right.
We have different packages that could be configured for your usage.
Mhm.
And so in that mix, there's one more component to it, and that is the number of items that are in the bill of materials being more than normal, than you would normally expect.
Right.
So I say all of that piece to kind of to give a little bit of background, but your question regarding the time of this manufacturing process. So the testing portion and to validate, once the actual robot, the arm, and the computer that drives the arm and all of the other components are final assembled. Once you have everything fully assembled, there is the testing and validating portion. And that piece can be extensive if there are settings that the end of line testing process doesn't account or keep into tying. And when I say that, I mean from the standpoint of there is a technician and then there is the testing computer. So when the technician is testing one arm, 2 arms, 3 arms, you can
Right.
imagine how you need to adjust your manufacturing process to be able to accommodate for that. So do you up the number of test tools that you have? In some cases you may, or do you, to avoid the increased labor that typically people would throw at a situation like that. So we've come up with some creative ways to put in-process testing in, validate that process, and then also to put in, set it up in a way that we don't have to add additional technicians every time we have a new process to be included in this testing, if
Right.
that makes sense.
No,
Yeah.
that makes sense. So that's fascinating to me anyway. So I think the audience find that fascinating too. But what would you say the 2 or 3 biggest challenges that you've had to deal with? And I mean, one of the aspects that, and we're going to talk about this more as we talk about remote work. Before the pandemic has tenfold increased those that are working remote. So 54% of the population is working remote. And we're going to tie all these things in regards to telehealth and investment in those areas, and then the remote piece too. What do you see is, so for the half of the people that are involved in production, involved in aspects of how do you keep that environment safe? How do you manage traceability when you have somebody that tests positive for COVID? There's a whole degree of complexity now that's added, right? So maybe you could talk about the 2 or 3 biggest challenges you've seen since the pandemic from a manufacturing perspective.
Well, number one, so there's the obvious ones, right? There's supply chain. So we've seen issues with clogging in the supply chain. We've seen issues with suppliers wanting to dump or unload more inventory on their customers.
Sure.
We've also seen some instances where the supply chain is full and has everything that we need, but we're not ready to pull yet, right? So because we've had to accommodate for COVID protocols within our manufacturing process, getting everybody trained to be able to follow those protocols. And it goes a little bit beyond, some companies are back to manufacturing. They've got PPE set up. They've got, you got to wear a mask, and they've moved workstations and testing stations 6 feet apart. But in addition to that, knowing how, the capacity of the building, how many people are you going to let inside for the day, or scheduling testing time in bays and scheduling testing time with tools has become not a challenge, but something that we've had to reconfigure, right? Because the pandemic hit at a time where things were just clocking along and everybody was working at their own pace. Now we almost had to stop and work at the pace of the pandemic.
Absolutely. Yeah. Do you have to enter the building, and for those that are working on site, are you doing temperature testing when you come in the building?
Absolutely, yeah. So we have we actually have a pandemic team that formed almost out of necessity to make sure that all of our buildings globally were following not just CDC guidelines, but we put in place our own practices as well. Temperature checks and physical distancing, hand washing, and mask wearing. Yeah.
And so one of our, we actually have a supply chain subject matter expert who's one of our, is watching us right now. So hopefully he'll have some good questions or insights that I would love to get his thoughts on the supply side of it. Have you seen, what have the challenges been in terms of your suppliers managing the risk there from an audit standpoint? Is it all virtual? Are you doing a combination of that?
That's interesting that you ask. Some of our suppliers are international anyway, so we had already established a way to communicate with them virtually. We do have some local vendors that were coming on site to exchange and communicate with us, have weekly, monthly meetings with. But we were pretty much set up prior to the pandemic to be able to communicate and meet and to exchange information with vendors virtually prior to the pandemic.
Gotcha. Okay.
That's a good question. I think that, as a part of the COVID compliance and some of the setup that companies are using this virtual experience and tool to do a lot of their daily operations. You think about how you could use, some companies may have a daily walkthrough manufacturing, and you think about how you can use a laptop or a iPad to do your walkthroughs for folks who aren't in the facility for the day.
Right.
I think of even, the things that you're doing at Shurig Solutions to foster virtual experiences that are beneficial to both your clients and your customers, some of your suppliers as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things the pandemic has certainly done for me from a thought process standpoint, and I told my wife the other day, I wish I was smart enough to think of some of these things 4 years ago, because how innovative they would have been before the pandemic. But just in terms of creating a better experience for the candidate and for our hiring managers or our clients who have adopted this. And for example, we've had 6 clients since the pandemic started where we're taking the experience for the candidate, I think, to the next level in terms of putting together, we call it a position brief that's got a lot of neat IT stuff in it. And we do an interview with the hiring manager, focus on it, and we create this scenario where they're getting a better feel of the culture, the leadership style, and what's attractive about the position. And what it's really done is, from my perspective, as the candidate moves to that interview with the hiring manager, and all this stuff's virtual now, right? So they're getting to see them. We're skipping the phone call for the most part. And personally, if a company's still doing phone interviews, I mean, and there are some. There's some that'll do I have clients, no, don't mean to be judgmental from that standpoint,
Sure.
that somebody's still doing a phone interview, but for several of my clients, there's no phone interview now. It goes right into a video interview. Because and the thing that I love about it, it's very easy. And when we do our prep, and you may remember this from the past, but from accomplished problems and abilities, and how you re-verify the information, how you listen to understand. When you're on the phone, we're such a microwave society. Everything's texts and this and that, and emails coming across. You're trying to pay attention, but it's very easy to get distracted when you're on the phone.
Right.
So it takes all that away. So from an efficiency of the process goes up, and in terms of making sure that that time's valuable and that you're really capturing what the skills, what the cultural fit is, and what that person has done, or what, if you're the hiring manager, you need the person to do. I think it has the ability to decrease the time frame and make those conversations more efficient, more valuable.
That's important. Very important.
So let's talk about telehealth for and since I talked about the growth in the robotic surgical area, one of the things I wanted to bring out for those that are listening, because all these things to me tie in together, and there are certain companies and certain places that the pandemic was a huge shock for all of us, but for certain companies that are more focused on, you don't really have autonomy in terms of the structure of your schedule. There's not remote days. And I have clients that, no, that's just not, if you've got a sick child or you got something going on, or, getting something installed in your house, of course you have that. But in terms of, well, I want to work from home 1 day a week or 2 days a week, that's just wasn't really an option. And now for the last year, they're all working 100% remote. A lot of the things and types of skill sets, positions we work on, certainly in regulatory affairs, certainly in aspects of clinical affairs, marketing, certain operational types or corporate positions, design, quality, all of those can be done remotely, right? If you're not
absolutely
hands-on from a production standpoint, there's a lot of things. So now all of a sudden it's like, what's that paradigm shift going to look like? We talked about how much the growth in terms of how many people are working remotely. The most recent study I saw said 56%. So when you look at telehealth, for instance, and in terms of, I think you and I talked about this earlier, but monitoring, wearables, robotics, artificial intelligence are like 5 or 6 of the key categories in terms of where that's going. In 2018, okay, telehealth was about $34-35 billion globally. It is growing at about a 24 to 5% continuous annual growth rate, and is projected to be about $185 billion by 2026. That's incredible.
Yeah, that's huge. When you talk about the landscape of the healthcare, just the healthcare landscape itself, and you mentioned wearables, but there's also data. There's data with everything. So definitely some of the opportunities for these roles in some of the companies can't be done from home or remotely, especially when you're dealing with analyzing data or providing feedback on submissions. The things from a regulatory affairs standpoint can definitely be remote.
Yes. So from a telehealth standpoint, and we'll talk about, I'll share what investment, joint venture capital, startups, it's incredible. The numbers are incredible. But Kinsey did a survey in January, I believe. But before the pandemic, only 11% of consumers in the United States were involved in any aspect of telehealth. And that number's grown to 46% since the pandemic's hit. And from that survey, most people, after we get out of this pandemic, are still have like over 70% of those surveys have a desire to continue to have aspects of telehealth, not driving to the doctor's office, not going for some of these more simple aspects of care.
Right. Right.
And so, that's a really big deal in terms of investment. Okay. I'm going to pull up my notes here real quick because I'm not smart enough to remember this piece. But we talked about the breakdown of what that looks like. So before the pandemic, in terms of startups and investment and joint venture capital for telehealth in 2019, it was $1.8 billion invested in that area. In the first 9 months, 2020, $3.2 billion invested in startups. Now, across all of the areas, telehealth just being one of it. So virtual health, what we talked about, wearables, monitoring, robotic surgical. So there were $2.1 billion of money invested into startups, 121 deals total in the third quarter this last year. Wow. I mean, it's just incredible.
It's very incredible. I think, and maybe this is posing a question, and maybe our audience can chime in later or ask some additional questions. I'd like to hear the exchange of this, but as you think about some people who, I started the conversation talking about pivot, right? And so some people who have taken advantage of this, maybe they're considering as downtime during the pandemic to foster these new ideas. So all of these startups are starting to come to fruition because people are really digging in and taking the time to invest not only in themselves, but in the community, right? In a pivot situation, you want to look for those opportunities that are going to meet a need. It's going to be a product or a service that's going to meet a need, but you're also going to look for something that I hope that people are looking for something that's going to be helpful for the populations in need or communities in need. Right. And maybe that's speaking to some of the increase that you're talking about here.
Disruption, right? And at Labs Convergence in September, they did a great job. It's the first virtual one they've ever had. Some of the three biggest categories that were constantly being talked about: innovation from the disruption. Obviously, you can find plenty of negativity. There's plenty of doom and gloom. I feel for the challenges that people have had. Absolutely. There's great empathy there. At the same time, I try to stay, I try to read and educate, learn, grow, but focus on proactivity, focus on finding the positives, because you could get drowned and inundated in the negative, unfortunately.
Right.
So one of the big themes there, medical device, software as a medical device, artificial intelligence, remote clinical, and how the pandemic has accentuated positive things coming from the disruption of the pandemic. And so I think you're right from that standpoint. And then we'll tie in a couple more things, particularly relevant to remote. So let's. I think we're already almost halfway through our time. I think we could talk. I could just ask you questions about robotic surgical platforms for the next half hour, but I don't know that everybody else would love that. But so let's move into our topic in terms of repurposing resources, repositioning resources. And if you want, I'm happy to go first and kind of share some things that I'm seeing from an industry standpoint and some of our clients. And I'd like to get an idea of what you've seen and what some things that you guys have done in terms of using resources differently and repositioning.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead. Why don't you start? I'd really like to hear, from your aspect, and maybe you'll cover this from your company's viewpoint, when you see request, or when you get request, or when you have asked for a certain talent or a certain role, how is the hiring manager suggesting that role either became open or it became available? And is it because some talent has been repurposed or repositioned?
No, that's great. So I would say that we have not worked on a lot of open positions because somebody has specifically because of the pandemic. been repositioned to a new role per se. I think that, so from an industry standpoint for our company, I started out focused med device, surgical in particular. We do a lot of surgical types of clients in a variety of clinical areas. And so those surgeries, obviously, the industry was 70% decrease in profits between April to, August, September, October. So hit really hard because those elective surgeries were not being done. And
Absolutely.
so for us, a lot of those positions all went on hold. Multiple of our clients furloughed. Some unfortunately did layoffs. A lot of those furloughs came back in the July, August timeframe. We're about, at that time, probably 75, 80% in those areas. And then we're IVD and we're pharma. But we've been doing the med device the longest, IVD 2.5 years, pharma 3 years. And so we were blessed to be able to have, still have things to work on. And we've grown that piece, the life science, the pharma, the IVD piece. And the pandemic has obviously accentuated diagnostics, accentuated testing. It's exploded. So a lot of our, those clients in IVD and pharma have grown. And then on top of that, from a clinical standpoint, phase 3 clinical trials, the regulatory submissions, that piece, we're doing a lot of regulatory positions to help drive that product development and get it to market. So a lot of those positions are brand new. It's a very tight market from that standpoint. So haven't seen a lot of scenarios where we're working on something because it got repositioned. But from a repositioning standpoint, I've seen certainly a lot of large companies with talent acquisition. Now they're working on HR, more internal HR, supporting business processes in the business unit because they're not recruiting or looking at trying to find talent, training, sales that's being repurposed to support operations, support managing tracing, because they're not getting to see people. They're not going, especially if they're dealing with hospitals, surgeons. So repurposing from that standpoint. What else? We've also seen marketing being repurposed to other things, just trying to figure out how to utilize resources and where people can bring value and they're not being laid off, obviously, or they're not being furloughed.
Yeah. That's
so
good.
I don't know if that answers the question.
That does. It answers my question. I think from TransEnterix point of view, we saw early on some transition in resources, but we have recently been able to begin the hiring process back again. So I think it just ebbs and flows with where the market is in particular with the roles that we have, right? We have a lot of engineering on the development side, software engineering, those types of roles that are in demand all the time. And as we go into these additional products that we're offering, the artificial intelligence and things like that, they become more in demand. And now that companies have maybe taken off and started doing more innovating, right? Spending more time on the R&D side, spending more time filing 510Ks, spending more time just preparing for the next big launch, they're able to move some of this talent into those roles. Yeah.
So in terms of, one of the questions you asked is sort of, if I understood you correctly, not just the repurposing piece, but how do people view that position, and what that position looks like from a remote standpoint. I think that, again, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think it's a huge paradigm shift. And how are companies, I know one global company, I used to work for one of their business units in my past life, is literally targeting top regulatory affairs talent from their competitors to allow them to work 100% remote. They don't care where they're at.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
I think it's very smart. It's very strategic. I've been saying for 2 years before the pandemic, That if
Absolutely.
I was in Boston, if I owned a business in Boston, I owned a business in California, I would not be worried about bringing certain of the areas that we work on, relocating people, paying a higher salary and compensation because of the cost of living. I'd focus on the best talent, and I'd look at where they're at, save cost on what that piece looks like, give them a great opportunity, bring them in for training, but then you could do a lot of stuff in terms of, the pandemic's proved that, through IT, still do everything you need to do, and then bring them in, once a quarter, once every 2 months, or whatever is needed from a team standpoint. So I think that's.
Do you have a lot of maybe prospective candidates who are also asking as a part of their checklist of the things that they're looking for in a role? Are they looking for virtual work? Are they looking for that opportunity to flex their schedule, a couple of days a week?
So let's talk about that a little bit. And absolutely, candidates 2 years ago were asking, hey, what about remote positions? Do you get remote positions? And I think I'd worked on 2 in regulatory before the pandemic, because particularly in med device, pharma has been more open to it. Med device, what I found in certain areas, it's like and supply and demand in several of the areas that we work in is really tough. For every 50 open jobs for regulatory affairs, for design quality, for instance, clinical is really bad, clinical research. Especially if it's a manager level, let's say every 50 positions, there's like 3 to 5 qualified people.
Okay.
I mean, it's really tight.
That's
so
tight.
What I would see is a lot of times with regulatory, you see somebody spend with the company 5 years, spouse moves, or spouse gets a job someplace else, they're going to move. Client knows how hard it is to fill that position. So they let them work remote. They've already, there's trust, there's value there. But a lot of med device companies before the pandemic were real resistant. I mean, that's not even a conversation. Like, it's not even an option. And so I think it's going to be really interesting, because there's a whole year of data showing.
Absolutely. Showing how productive people are, how many projects are getting completed, satisfaction in employee.
Yes. And I've always said that when I got into the corporate world, sales, business development, marketing, that 12 years, I never had a home office, I never had an office. I had a home office, and I traveled, and then I worked from home. And I think you hire the right talent, the right person. The biggest challenge is making sure that they set boundaries, because you can work all the time.
Right.
If you work from home.
You work from home, yeah.
And I personally, I mean, that's great. I like that autonomy, but I'm a people person. I want to be at the office. I want to be around my team, with autonomy and flexibility. And that's kind of what I provide my people too. But so there was a CNBC article and survey that was done. It was in November. And so from that article, this was like 75% of the people surveyed are expecting post-pandemic to have 1 to 2 remote days and continue to have autonomy or some sort of flex schedule after the pandemic. Now that particular, I've read all kinds of different articles, a lot relevant to product development, clinical studies, and that process. So this particular study was not relevant to med device or pharma or our niches. It was all workers. But to me, that even more accentuates what it's going to be. And from the people that I talk to on a regular basis, in terms from a candidate standpoint, in our areas, because of how niche they are. And because there's aspects of it that you can do. So the company that is going to draw a line in the sand and be like, hey, we're not going to do that. I think in the next 2 years, they're going to have a lot of problems with talent.
They're going to have a lot of problems. And they're going to risk losing some good talent.
Absolutely.
They're going to risk being able to meet, project deadlines because they weren't able to hire in time, because they're not open to this form of working. And that would be unfortunate.
There are certain positions that we're working on there that are remote, and they'll remain remote with some travel in. But there are also quite a few positions that we're working on where they'll need to relocate at some point after the pandemic. and that's in a sense understandable because of the type of position they are. But I think it's interesting because there are some positions where that sort of pre-pandemic thinking, we're not okay with that. We're not okay with autonomy, remote days. And they're going to be in situations where they're going to have this person come in. They're going to have successfully worked remotely and done their job responsibilities for anywhere from 3 to 6 months. And then they're going to say, oh, now we want you to move. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. Yeah.
What it does to the marketplace. And I think the other thing that's happened is there are more people that are open to contract work that would have never been open to contract work. I just talked to a great candidate, and got known for a couple of years now, who wanted to have a conversation about a particular market niche, and he's about leaving a full-time permanent position to go to a 6 to 12-month contract in a growing field. And it's like, should I do this? Should I not do this? Well, obviously, I'm open to betting on myself, right? I mean,
obviously, yeah.
So it's like, I mean, why wouldn't you do that? Depending on what it is. I mean, obviously, you don't want to go to a 6-month contract with vinyl record manufacturing. That probably wouldn't be a very good idea, right?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
But so the other thing, as we talk about repurposing, let's focus on the remote piece again. So let's see if I can say this correctly, because before I do, what's the field there? Like, are people going to continue to have opportunities to work remote, or is the company more open to remote talent? Because like you just mentioned, software design, firmware, microcontrollers, all ties in to what TransEnterix does. And a lot of that talent, can work remotely. Yeah,
it can and does. And I think with the leadership in our team is pretty open to it. We have been very successful this past year. Again, but prior to the pandemic, we have a different setup. So prior to the pandemic, we really did work internationally, and across the globe as a virtual company. A lot prior to the pandemic. We have teams. In fact, half of my team is in another country. So I face
Europe, right?
Yeah, we're in Europe, and we have also offices in Israel, and now starting up in Japan. So we are pretty much skilled at being global and being able to work remotely with each other.
So I'm
for some companies that didn't have that prior to the pandemic, I can understand, the hoops that they had to jump to get it set up. But I think that they're probably seeing the benefits of it, and realizing how productive people are.
So one of our the people watching, he said it's for supply chain. It's been a mix of remote and on-site audits. He's really a subject matter expert in the whole aspect of supplier remediation, oversight, selection, everything.
I'm glad he brought that up. We have had definitely some audit opportunities this past year on, both external and internal. And working remotely gives us that flexibility. So if you have to be in for the audit physically, you can, but most of our audits have taken place virtually. And we've just been able to work with our auditing bodies, the companies, on their platform, either on Teams or whichever teleconferencing package that they're using to complete the audit, and it's been successful.
So one of another viewer, Stephanie, said made a comment about great insight regarding opportunities to work remotely and trends. So another story I'll share with you. It's actually not a direct client of ours yet. We were looking at doing some things together this last year, and it's all been delayed because of the pandemic. But one of the positions we were talking about was supporting their, it's a pretty big company, a lot of different locations. So supporting a corporate supplier, a corporate auditing and compliance position. Going to a lot of different products, going to different plants, doing the auditing, making sure up to standards compliance, some of it international. And so that job position was a 50 to 60% travel on the worst case. Because if you go over international, you're going to be gone a week, multi-site.
At least,
well,
yeah.
Because of that, and because of the pandemic, they started to put in a corporate remote auditing playbook, and there used to always be 2 auditors go for every audit, travel. And now they're going to be in a situation, even post-pandemic, where they'll always have 1 virtual auditor, 1 on site, and the travel is going to go down to like 20-25%.
Cut it at least in half. Yeah, I think that that's a good segue into also, for the company to evaluate, when it's the right time to open up some of the positions to virtual and remote.
So I'll bring up, I'll share this. Okay. There was an article, actually a survey, and I'll try to say this correctly because it's the Deutsche Bank. So it's a German bank. I look at it and I want to say Deutsche Bank.
Deutsche.
But that's not it. It's Deutsche Bank. Okay. So they did a survey, and I believe it was in November, but the survey found that over 2/3 of workers, similar to what I mentioned about that CNBC article from October, want to continue to work at least 2 to 3 days. The Deutsche survey said at least 2 to 3 days after the pandemic, they expect to work from home. Now, the interesting thing about that, they talked about in this study and in this article that remote is changing. And we talked about earlier about how 54% workforce in the United States, I think in Germany it was 48%, if I remember correctly, are working at home. But so much that they're thinking about having a remote work from home tax.
And wow. Okay.
If they did that in the United States, it would be in 1 year, based on the amount of people working from remote right now, it'd be $48 billion with a B.
Wow.
I mean, so again, we talk about all this investment in certain areas. We talk about what's going on with telemedicine. I think I was saying earlier about how much telehealth's grown. 38 or 35 billion, 2018, predicted to go to like 135 or 185. That's via Fortune magazine. So you look at the growth there. You look at people wanting to continue to take advantage of that. You look at people working remotely, wanting to be able to continue to have that autonomy. And then you look at the investment that's going into these different segments. And so I just think it's going to be really, really interesting to see what happens and see what companies adjust and what don't, and how that affects their ability to bring in top talent.
Yeah, I agree. And I hope that, the companies are taking the data and collecting the data now to help them be able to make those decisions in the year's end, right? Because I think towards the end of this year, we'll start to maybe see some things open up after several months of vaccinations getting shots in arms, maybe towards the first quarter of 2022. But that would be interesting to see how they are going to use the data that they've collected from a productivity. They measure, companies measure productivity different ways, but it's also a satisfaction survey, right? So,
Absolutely.
How is the employee satisfied, and you can also see the company's results as well, right, for their gains and losses. So, and
you also see there's been a relatively big exodus from bigger cities, and and there's certainly I don't want to get into the politics of it, but we have clients in 15 states, and we have certain places are much more locked down than others. And we have clients and candidates in places where they're like, well, you went out to eat last night, like in Indiana, like you can do that, right? And so that's going to add a factor to it as well. So it's going to be really interesting. The IVD piece and the diagnostic, it just makes me follow sort of what's going on with the vaccines and that particular industry even more. But J&J, we just did our, I don't know if it's been posted yet. So we do the SSI in the news business developments And it's
Okay.
sort of been a work in progress, but now what we're doing is we're highlighting, 5, 6 things that are going on. We post it once a week. And so J&J just got emergency FDA approval for their vaccine, which is one shot.
Mm-hmm.
And is supposed to be effective against other variants, other strains of COVID-19. So that should hopefully open up things even more. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. So we've leapfrogged one of the topics that I wanted to get to. So we're running out of time. So let's jump back to it real quick. Talk a little bit about PDCA.
Okay.
Because I know that's something that you're a subject matter expert in. I know when you and I first talked about it, I was like, wait a minute, that's like kind of lean, Kaizen, right? And you don't hear it talked about a lot at this point. So, I'd love for you to kind of talk a little bit about your experience there and how you utilize that in your position now.
Sure. I think, we are running out of time. This conversation has gone up quicker. I think delving into the conversation on telework and even dipping into some of the expectations for companies and candidates in the future, that was beneficial for our audience tonight, I hope. I really wanted to touch on PDCA and its Plan, Do, Check, Act. It's an older tool. But it's an oldie but goodie. I think that it's also known as Plan, Do, Study Act, and it's a way to involve your teams to continuously improve. So it was supported by Deming. It is something that companies maybe prior to the explosion of the lean scene, you'll use as a problem solving method and methodology along with the typical 5 whys and DMAIC and those types of approaches. But I think that the important thing about it is it's just so versatile, right? You can use it across any type of problem that you're trying to solve. If it's not too specific to a certain niche, you can definitely expand it. But what's also good about it is at the end, if you do your planning and you decide on you have a problem, and then you study that problem, you check that problem, you figure out how you're going to do your study, and then you look at your results and analyze. Well, when you get to the act part, you have the opportunity to, if you like the results that you got from your study, to act, but you also have the opportunity to abandon. And sometimes when we use this life cycle to do continuous improvement, it'll help you get to a resolution on which things you want to implement and which things that you got enough data now that tells you shouldn't implement. So I think that I'm only resurfacing that as a tool that is definitely one that can be used, especially as these companies go into thoughts on pivoting, right?
Absolutely. And I love, like, as you described that, one of the things I like about the types of positions we get to work on, and really your background, it all leads to do it well, proactivity. Everything about what you just talked about is proactivity. The other thing that you just said that immediately made me want to laugh is, getting enough data points to realize you don't want to do that. You don't want to implement something. I'd say probably some of the better decisions I've made are the ones that I didn't do, right? So you've tried some things that worked better than others. And there's some things that, hey, this could be a great idea. And then look at it, get enough data and go, yeah, it's probably not a very good idea.
Yeah, so, but letting the data drive the decision, I think, is key, because a lot of times we get in the heat of the moment and we're looking at things from, oh my goodness, this big pandemic is hit. What are we going to do? Well, don't just make a decision based on emotion. Let's let the data help us to decide.
So we did a webinar on supplier, all aspects of supplier, and Chris on that talked about, look, if you're going to look at data and you're going to create best practices for how you look at data, you better be acting on it. Especially from a regulatory compliance standpoint. Like, don't make certain aspects of collecting data part of your process and then not look at it, not act off of it. And to your point, you've got to constantly be looking at the data, looking at where you're going and where you can improve your best practices.
Yes. Absolutely.
So here's what I want to do with the last minutes that we have left. I probably should have just skipped the PDCA and scheduled another time just to
Maybe
talk
a
about that.
separate
Right?
topic. Yeah.
So from a proactivity standpoint, if you feel comfortable with it, I'd like for you to share a little bit about your personal perspective on the pandemic, who you are, sort of how you've dealt with it. Your family. I think you're a very proactive, positive person, and just I'd love to get your thoughts on it.
Well, I think that it definitely was a new way to do things in our household. With the commute, I'm in a commuting role right now, and the commuting stopped, and I was actually able to work from home, which is in a different state than where my corporate headquarters is. And that has afforded, us some opportunities to do some things as a family, which you have some experience with your family as well.
Right.
But it has created even some challenges, right? So you've got, more than one person in the house consuming the internet, and your Wi-Fi is overloaded, and figuring out how to deal with that was an initial issue that we were able to challenge ourselves with creatively. So I took on the role of selecting my position in my physical location in the house before everyone else did and got the best seat. No, but all jokes aside, I think that the pandemic has surprised me in some ways, right? I am impressed with these companies who are just doing the best at changing their product portfolios. I came across an article when I was looking up for some examples to share tonight of a company. It's a bioscience company out west who would normally make solutions for people with solutions for like urological conditions.
Right.
And they were able to take their technology and pivot into making a rapid test, a rapid blood test, a rapid antibody test that is a 15-minute test and a 15-minute result. So I like to read those stories and see how those companies are coming up with these new technologies and new ways. And then you think about, and that's a brand new startup company. So you talked about how those are exploding in the industry right now. But then there's also the existing firm companies who have had to make some changes as well and have elected to take on a whole new persona. I think about companies like Kodak. They were in imaging and they were in film for forever, and now they're in pharmaceuticals.
Right.
So that type of thing excites me and impresses me. Even within our company, some of the things that we've been able to do remotely, having those virtual meetings, having those submitting products for approval and doing all of this work remotely has really been good to see happen in the last couple of months and be successful at it. So I think that there's a lot of good things that have been brought on by the pandemic, and some of the companies that are choosing to use their platform for some positive things in the community is very, very impressive to see.
Yeah, I think that's great. And as you talked about some of those specific things, I think about, there was a automotive plant that was repurposed in Kokomo, Indiana. Yes, I believe it's in Kokomo to make ventilators. And they did an incredible job of that. So a lot of collaboration, companies, I don't think a lot of people realize in BioNTech partnering with Pfizer that they had I think 10 years of research and information about strains of COVID, but they didn't have the resources to be able to do what needed to be done. And then you have these two companies partnering together. You've got, AstraZeneca, you've got all these different things going on, and a lot more collaboration to the benefit of obviously everybody. So certainly being able to recreate ourselves and find areas where we can take negative and move it to something positive and benefit other people.
Absolutely.
Great. A lot to learn from the pandemic from that standpoint.
a lot. Yeah, I think we also have a lot to learn. And hopefully we're like we mentioned briefly, we're using the data to teach us. Yeah.
Right. So I want to thank everybody from an audience standpoint that got on tonight and had the opportunity to join us. Hopefully you found this beneficial. And if usually we say this up front, but if somebody has something, a question that you'd like to share, feel free to. I know there's a couple things that have been popped up, but if you think about something later that you'd like to get her perspective on, send it to me. At my email or info@shurigsolutions.com, and we'll share it with Shalom, and she'll give us her perspective on that. But
absolutely, yeah, questions, or if you just like to share best practices, that's great. That's great.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. I've always enjoyed when we've gotten to interact, and after the pandemic, some point we'll have to break some bread in North Carolina
Absolutely.
or Florida or somewhere.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your thoughts, and having hopefully what people find is a productive conversation about kind of what's going on in the industry and some of the things that we can learn from the challenges. So
thank you. I enjoyed our conversation this evening. You shared some insights from a company standpoint as well that were beneficial to hear. So I appreciate the dialogue and look forward to talking with you soon.
Awesome. We'll be making a white paper from this in terms of maybe some of the highlights of the things that people might find interesting, and sharing that. And then we'll after we finish up, and the people that actually are good at IT, not me, clean everything up and throw some music to it. We'll post it for those that maybe wanted to come and weren't able to, so they can watch it after the fact. So thanks so much, Shalom. Thanks so much for our audience. I hope this brought you value, and we look forward to partnering and sharing opportunities, skills, and training, and other proactive and positive things that hopefully people find beneficial in the future. So everybody have a great night. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Hear me, won't you speak to me when I open up? And I forward my thoughts to you, but sometimes I'd say you're thinking too much, and I don't want to hide.